Welcome to This Explainer. For a lot of us, adulthood brings this sudden, really quiet realization just being in the exact same room as your family has somehow become completely exhausting. Today, we're diving straight into the deep, uncompromising psychology behind why growing up so often means we just have to step away. Let's get right into it. So there is this heavy kind of hidden guilt that so many independent adults carry around with them today. It's that visceral urge you might feel to just pack up and move to a totally new city. Or, letting the phone ring a few extra times before you finally pick up. Or maybe, if we're being completely honest, not picking up at all. It's this drive to consciously build a geographical shield between yourself and your parents. And the absolutely crucial point here, the thing we really need to understand right off the bat, is that this urge doesn't come from a place of malice. It's not hatred. It comes from a desperate, deeply biological need for breathing room. Honestly, it is just a survival instinct. Now, if you've ever felt this, you also know the heavy shame that tends to follow right behind it. You're left wondering, why does seeking something as perfectly natural as independence, why does it feel like a profound betrayal to the very people who raised you? Well, I want to completely validate that uncomfortable emotion for you right now. This feeling of betrayal, it's a completely natural symptom of trying to find your autonomy within what psychologists call a highly fused family system. In these kinds of environments, the family operates almost like a single emotional organism. So when you actually try to establish your own individuality, the system doesn't register it as you growing up. No, it registers it as a direct threat to its very togetherness. Section 1. The illusion of escaping, looking at geographic versus emotional distance. We see this massive trend today, right? People choosing geographic escape, moving away, going no contact. But we really need to deconstruct this idea because there is a vast, vast difference between a geographical shield, which is literally just the physical miles you put between you and your family, and a clinical concept developed by Murray Bowen known as emotional cutoff. Packing your bags and moving does not inherently sever your underlying emotional dependency. You could literally move 3,000 miles away, you could change your phone number, you could never speak to your family again, but if that internal emotional reactivity is still sitting there outside of you, you haven't actually separated. You've merely hit the mute button on a stereo that is internally still blaring at full volume. Let's just pause and sit with the weight of that for a second. Running away? It's an illusion, because if a parent's disapproval still dictates your internal self-talk across an entire ocean, if their imagined criticism is still influencing what career you choose or how you parent your own kids, or even just how you feel about yourself on a random Tuesday morning, then you are still bound to them. A geographic shield literally does nothing if the internalized voice of your family just continues to govern your life choices from thousands of miles away. You think you're free because you're in a different zip code, but psychologically, you're still living in your childhood bedroom. Section 2. Murray Bowen's differentiation of self. So the core concept we need to deeply understand here is called differentiation of self. In psychology, it's defined as the capacity to maintain your emotional objectivity and your own individuality, all while actually remaining connected to the family system. It is basically the highest level of psychological maturity you can reach. It's this incredibly delicate, mature balance between our innate biological drive for individual autonomy and our deep instinctual need for family togetherness. Ultimately, it means you have the ability to be a distinct I while still participating in a we. Let's think about what happens when this balance is totally missing compared to when it's strongly present. In a state of emotional fusion, family members just automatically absorb each other's chronic anxieties. It's like emotional contagion. If a parent is anxious, the adult child instantly feels anxious or somehow responsible to fix it. There's just no protective barrier there. But a solid self operates in an entirely different way. A solid self is deeply grounded in its own inner principles. It responds to family tension with clear, objective thought instead of reactive guilt or defensive anger. Basically, a solid self has a highly functioning internal firewall. Section 3. The 3 dimensions of boundaries. Let's break down the mechanics of distance. So, the big question, how do we actually build that firewall? Well, we do it by breaking down the mechanics of distance into 3 distinct dimensions. The first dimension is physical distance. This is the tangible space, right? The geographical borders, moving to a new state, the locked doors, the ignored text messages. It is the most basic, the most visible, and definitely the most common boundary we reach for when we're overwhelmed. But here's the catch. From a psychological standpoint, it is ultimately the least deeply rooted form of separation. It requires the absolute least amount of emotional maturity to execute simply because you are relying on physical space to do all the heavy lifting for you. Now, the second dimension is emotional distance, and you might know this one pretty intimately. This is where your interactions with your family become highly formal, shallow, or just extremely carefully curated. You still show up to the holiday dinner, but you actively minimize any shared vulnerabilities. You stick strictly to safe topics like the weather or sports, desperately avoiding any deep conversations because you know it'll trigger the family's shared chronic anxiety or their tendency to project their own issues onto you. You are physically present in the room, sure, but emotionally, you are effectively in hiding. And then we finally reach the third dimension. This is the ultimate goal of differentiation: psychological boundaries. This is the internal barrier where your thoughts end and your family's anxieties begin. This is where true separation actually happens, internally. When you build a strong psychological boundary, you're essentially creating an invisible shield that is entirely independent of physical proximity. You don't need an entire ocean between you and your parents to feel safe anymore because your own mind has become your sanctuary. Section 4. The internalized family voice and carrying unresolved fears. See, when psychological boundaries fail, we become captive to that internalized family voice. We end up carrying our parents' unresolved fears like a phantom tether that basically dictates our emotional weather. Which brings us to one of the most uncompromising, jarring truths in all of family psychology, directly from Murray Bowen himself. The person who runs away from his family of origin is as emotionally dependent as the one who never leaves home. Just think about that. Fiercely reactive distancing, slamming the door, storming off into the night, cutting people off out of pure anger, is paradoxically a sign of intense fusion. Actually, scratch that. It's not just fusion. It literally proves that the family's emotional pull over you is so overpowering that your only possible defense mechanism is extreme flight. That's not true grounded independence.
Section 5. Space to form a self. Let's talk about reframing our boundaries.
So how do we shift the narrative here? How do we move from this heavy psychological diagnosis to actual real-life liberation? We have to reframe what boundaries actually are. Creating distance is not some malicious rejection of your family. It is literally just clearing the overgrown brush on a plot of land so you can finally build your own house. And when that house is truly built, that is when you reach true maturity. You allow your family's anxieties, their judgments, and their dysfunctions to exist in the exact same room as you without them hijacking your emotional state. You finally attain that quiet, unshakable power to be physically near your family while remaining psychologically totally separate. You can observe their emotional storms without getting wet. And this brings us to the emotional core of everything we've unpacked in this explainer today. Distance is not always rejection. Sometimes it is the first space where a self can form. If you've had to create distance, whether physical or emotional, just to survive, you really do not need to carry the burden of hidden guilt. Creating that initial physical space is so often the vital, absolute prerequisite for building an authentic, solid self. Sometimes you literally just have to step out of the static so you can finally hear your own voice. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a profound, lingering question to really reflect on. If your geographic shield vanished today, if you had to sit at a table with your family right now, would your internal psychological boundaries be strong enough to protect your true self, or are you still relying on the miles between you to keep the peace? Building that internal shield, well, it's the work of a lifetime, but it is the absolute only path to true psychological freedom. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and keep building that solid self.